We by Russian writer Yevgeny Zamyatin is a 1920 speculative fiction novel credited with inspiring many of the great dystopian fictions that would follow over the coming decades, not least George Orwell's 1984. In the timeline of dystopian writing, it slots between H.G. Wells's The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, which preceded it by about 20 years, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Ayn Rand's novella Anthem, and 1984 itself, which all came along during the 1930s and 40s. In the timeline of world history, Wee's writing and publication fit between the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and the eventual rise of Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union and the events leading up to the important conflicts of the mid 20th century. I think many readers come to We via 1984, and the two are often compared and cross-referenced in introductions and afterwards, etc. Also, Orwell reviewed We for Tribune magazine and cited it as a direct influence on his own dystopian novel. I feel that this book deserves to be considered on its own terms and not just through the lens of 1984, not least because Zamyatin's book came first. However, some degree of comparison to the better known book is only natural. Once I'd scratched the surface of this book, I found that there was quite a lot to say about it. I've made a lot of notes while reading it, and I don't think that I can fit all of the analysis that I would like to into a review of any reasonable length. So, what I'll do is, after a brief outline of the plot and the world in which it's set, I'll base my review around two key words that I think are major themes in the text, and those are progress and self. Then, after that, I'll indulge myself in drawing out some conclusions on why I think We is a brilliant, important, and multifaceted work of 20th century literature. The reasons might surprise you. In reviewing any work of speculative fiction or science fiction, it's probably just as important to describe the setting, the circumstances, the world in which it takes place, as it is the characters and the plot. Set far in the future, something of the order of 1,000 years, long after a period of revolution referred to as the 200 Years' War, the 10 million or so surviving humans live in a walled city-state, the One State. The rest of the planet is assumed to have returned to a state of nature. Almost everything in the city is made of glass, including the outer wall, which is known as the Green Wall, since through it there's only the dense forest of the outside world to be seen. The city itself is a kind of glass panopticon where from the common spaces you can see into every home. The only possible privacy is afforded by blinds which can be lowered during the daily personal hour if you apply for a pink ticket for the purpose of maintaining intimate relations. The only place where the walls are not made of glass is the House of Antiquity, a kind of museum house that has been preserved to show you how the ancients lived. That's us. People, known in this world as numbers, since they don't have names, are ruled by a strict timetable, which they view with great reverence. We know early on in the story that the whole society has been shaped by a strict application of Taylorism, referring to Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was a real-life American engineer who developed the science of industrial optimization. So straight away, we're drawn into this conflict between efficiency and engineering for everything, an obsession with optimization, and how this leaves little room for everything that is natural, unpredictable, and basically human. Our protagonist, D503, is an engineer and has been raised not only to believe in the one state and its doctrine, but also to see the world through mathematics and cold reasoning. This is challenged when he meets and becomes infatuated with another number, I330, who rebels against the system in various ways, and D503 is brought along with her. Dee's struggle is essentially one of head versus heart, where by head I mean his upbringing, his training, his indoctrination into the system, and heart would be the desire to explore the possibility of a world beyond the status quo, to indulge his imagination and the idea of personal freedom. The extent to which there's any kind of meaningful romantic love between Dee and I-330 is limited. She more so represents temptation and the possibility of another, freer kind of life. Of all the points of comparison between We and 1984, it's the characters of I-330 and 1984's Julia and their relationships with the story's male protagonists that make for me the strongest similarity between the two books. This choice between freedom and happiness is made explicit in We, as Dee is faced with a red pill, blue pill decision. Is he fully committed to following I-330 in her acts of rebellion or not? The story makes allusions to the Garden of Eden, wherein humanity has sacrificed innocence and bliss in captivity for freedom and knowledge of the true nature of the world. So, in this view, the ancients, that's us here in our time, would be seen to have chosen freedom, but the result of that was chaos, violence, and worst of all, terribly inefficient production. The one state attempts to re-establish happiness through perfect equality and absolute control, undoing the original sin, foregoing freedom in order to create a new Eden. However, I-330's revolutionaries, the Mephi, presumably from Mephistopheles, threatened to bring down the system, to break out of the city, to eat once again from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that's the rough shape of the plot. Before I get into more detailed analysis, a comment on some of the ironies and the satirical nature of Zamyatin's One State. Firstly, most of the human population died in the establishment of this system. So the process of perfecting life has involved a great loss of life. Also, the state strives to create conditions of what it sees as an ideal life lived in blissful ignorance, but it's really beyond the wall that the earth has reverted to a state of nature. Most of the work of the state in this story goes directly or indirectly into building a rocket that's going on a mission to bring news of the one state and Taylorism to inhabitants of other planets. This feels like a satire of missionary colonialism, and I guess it also anticipates the expansion of the Soviet Union. It's this expansionist mission that provides the pretext for D503's journaling. He's been told to keep a diary because accounts of life under the system are to be sent along on the rocket with the mission. Therefore, they've overthrown the old regime with its silly sects and churches and faith. With all the harm and the killing that's been involved in that revolution, only for what is essentially a new religion to take hold. So we could take this as a comment on the Russian Revolution that was in progress at the time, or on the natures of revolutions in general. It's mentioned in the book that just as there is no highest number, there will be no last revolution. Note that this book was banned in Soviet Russia and was published abroad in English and French translations long before ever seeing the light of day at home. So, as I've mentioned, the one state has advanced society according to the principles of Taylorism, which is essentially a manufacturing philosophy originally concerned with building efficient factories, but which has been extended in this supposedly utopian world to rule every aspect of life. Virtually every moment of life is timetabled. The citizens, who remember are called numbers, even take their daily exercise by walking in lockstep together. They live in this glass-walled panopticon of a prison state where there's no individual freedom. However, everything is modern and clean and works correctly, and their every physical need is provided for. They get their nutrition from petroleum-based synthetic food, and they're provided with new uniforms, for the celebration of Unanimity Day. The state is designed under the assumption that everything can be engineered and optimized, and that leaves no room for the human, the soul, the imagination. Indeed, the development of a soul is considered to be a medical condition. Dreaming is described as a sickness, and the one state develops a medical procedure to remove the imagination. This is clearly drawing some inspiration from the emerging psychosurgical practices of the time, like electroshock therapy and the lobotomy. What brings the one state to life, what kind of makes it fun to read, is that our protagonist is clearly a product of this system. He's fully indoctrinated into it, even if we see how this is challenged as the plot unfolds. What's more, he's an engineer brought up in this world. He's one of the senior architects of the rocket that the state is building, and his training is to rationalize the world around him in terms of mathematics, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. But he's unsettled by the existence of something inside him which he can't explain or rationalize, or which isn't accounted for by the engineered and optimized world that he knows. He describes this feeling as being the square root of -1, i.e., the imaginary unit. This is the domain of imaginary numbers in mathematics. That means his own imagination and the possibility that maybe everyone has an imagination. This all takes place in a mechanized and technologically advanced world, as seen from the 1920s, of course. And the citizens are engaged in this task of building a rocket that's going to take them to discover other planets and essentially to colonize them. Reading this, Zamyatin's visionary fantasies of space travel reminded me a little of Isaac Asimov's early fantasies of robotics and artificial intelligence, written long before we knew what form these technologies would actually take. Although there is no comparison to be made between the quality of the two authors' prose, Zamyatin's world and his story are infinitely more skillfully crafted than Asimov's. The vision of space travel, briefly divulged in We, conjures up the aesthetic of a pre-spaceflight idea of what spaceflight might be. So think Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, or Georges Méliès's film Le Voyage dans la Lune, which was really created just a few years earlier. It's interesting to reflect that Zamyatin lived and wrote closer to the time of Jules Verne than to the present day. 1920 was a long time ago, and I love discovering these visions of the future as imagined from the past. As well as being a clear critique of the way things were going in Russia under the Bolsheviks, We seeks to show us a world where industrialization and urbanization are taken to their extremes, as people are brought off of the land into the city and stripped of their identity in order to work for the machine. The function of much dystopian fiction is to make a kind of reductio ad absurdum argument against the perceived direction of societal change, and I think that was very much Zamyatin's intent here. Ultimately, he shows that it will be difficult for authoritarianism to absolutely and enduringly overcome the human spirit. The one state has tried to strip its citizens of their humanity and treat them almost as automata. The essential conflict of We is the main character's development or discovery of a sense of self in a world where the self has essentially been abolished and people are both referred to and literally regarded as numbers. As an aside, this is almost exactly the setup of Ayn Rand's 1937 novella Anthem, although the stories play out differently and Rand adds many of her own ingenious touches. The awakening of D503's self comes through a couple of distinct means. Firstly, the device that makes the telling of the story narratively possible, which is that the numbers are asked to write diaries extolling the virtues of life in the one state for inclusion in the interplanetary mission. Secondly, he meets and develops this infatuation and then an intimate relationship with a female number, I330, who, we learn, has found ways to defy the system in order to clandestinely indulge in various hedonistic behaviours. That's basically smoking, drinking, and sex. The last of these is a little strange since we already know that both reproductive and recreational sex are a normal part of life in the one state. We learn in detail the procedure for numbers of both sexes to register for private time with another number, on which they are issued with a pink ticket, and this gives them permission to close the blinds of their glass fronted residence during their daily personal hour. And we know that it's not only for the purpose of making babies, since D503's regular partner O90 is deemed to be too short to pass on her genes. And yet she is allowed by the system to have lovers. Within the system of the one state, sex, the personal hour, the pink tickets, is really the only form of expression of the self or of personal preference that the numbers are allowed. It seems that numbers tend to form polycules, and we know that D503 is in a kind of triangle arrangement with O90 and their friend R13. We might briefly be excited to learn that R13 is a poet, and that poets are just as highly regarded in this world as the engineers. However, it quickly transpires that poets are really just creators of propaganda for the system, a cutting, if transparent, comment on the way that the arts were coming to be viewed in the nascent Soviet Union. In my introduction, I described the protagonist's dilemma as being between head and heart. However, really, that would be better described as a clash between that which is orderly, known, and controlled, and that which is chaotic, unknown, and free. And Zamyatin weaves this theme through the text in various guises. It's there, for example, in D503's two lovers, O90 and I330. One who is round, natural, calm, and motherly. The other, straight, angular, sharp, and dangerous. Compare this with the Bauhaus idea, which was fresh and fashionable at the time, that shapes had inherent qualities and values. The circle was associated with unity, harmony, spirituality, while the triangle had connotations of action, aggression, also of balance and progress. Furthermore, consider Wee's central struggle, the contrast between order and chaos, the mechanical and the human, the known and the unknown, in the context of Kandinsky's paintings, which juxtaposed basic shapes and geometric abstraction with complex curves, organic forms, and biomorphism. So what's the relevance of any of this? Well, I think it serves to locate Yevgeny Zamyatin's we, not just within a national, historical, and political context, but within the context of the broader avant-garde artistic and intellectual movements of the time. Note also that, like Kandinsky, Zamyatin was said to experience synesthesia, specifically associating sounds with colours, and there are many indications of this in we. The dichotomy at the heart of D503's story is also neatly represented via his attempts to understand the world through mathematics. If you're not a mathematician or an engineer, this might be lost on you, and that's fine. But Zamyatin was an engineer, and it's very deliberately crafted into the story that people have two components. We have our physical being, which accounts for our body and even our behavior, which can be largely understood, manipulated, and controlled. But we also have our soul and our imagination, represented within the protagonist's mind, remember, as the square root of -1, literally the imaginary unit I in mathematics. And that's the true reason why the people in we are numbers. Specifically, he's saying that human beings are complex numbers with a real and an imaginary component to each of us. Zamyatin is also telling us through his story and his language that the real, the physical, the corporeal part of our existence can be taken, can be seized, for example, by a totalitarian regime. but the imaginary component, which we can take as representing our literal imagination, our dreams, also our soul, cannot be conquered. I appreciate that with the biblical and Faustian allusions, the Bauhaus stuff, and especially with some of the mathematical ideas, imaginary numbers, etc., it might seem like I've gone off the deep end a little bit with this review. And that's before you even get to the political commentary on contemporary events, the Russian Revolution, etc. However, I want to reassure you that while this is a very, very clever and multi-layered book, it does also stand alone as a cool and interesting story without diving as deep as I have here. It's not a lazy read, but it's also not a very dense or very difficult book. It's a book that asks for a little bit of effort, that prioritizes showing over telling, and that is absolutely stuffed full of memorable, quotable phrases and ideas that you'll want to read again, underline, copy down to your notebook. Kudos is due there to the translator. I read the version by Bela Shayevich, and I can highly recommend it. It reads brilliantly, and that can't have been easy to achieve. I think a great amount of talent has gone into producing this. So that's it. We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. I hope you found it informative. Maybe you feel inspired to read it. Maybe you've already read it and you think that I've got it all wrong. Either way, leave a comment to say hi, and I'll see you in the next one.